The case we examine today is one of the most unsettling examples of what happens when isolation, strict tradition, and misguided beliefs intertwine across generations. It is the story of a single family who, in their quest for religious purity, unknowingly created what may be remembered as one of the most extreme genetic experiments in modern history. It all began in the late 19th century, in a remote and unforgiving corner of the Appalachian Mountains in the United States. Around 1880, a group of settlers, numbering no more than 24, sought refuge in a secluded valley encircled by steep ridges and dense forests. The region's geography alone was enough to discourage outsiders from entering, and for the settlers themselves, it provided exactly what they were searching for: isolation from what they believed was a corrupt and impure world. At the center of this group stood Joseph Jackson, the patriarch who envisioned a new beginning away from civilization. To outsiders, he may have seemed a stern but determined man. To those inside the valley, he was lawgiver, judge, and prophet. Joseph Jackson imposed a rigid code of conduct. His most uncompromising rules were simple but devastating in consequence: no contact with outsiders, no departure from the valley under any circumstances, and marriage only within the community itself. What Joseph saw as safeguarding spiritual purity soon became the foundation for a closed genetic pool that would spiral downward with each successive generation. In those first years, the Jackson family believed they had built a utopia. Freed from outside influence, they tilled the valley's soil, raised livestock, and carved out an existence entirely on their own terms. The valley's natural barriers reinforced the idea that their small world was all that truly mattered. Outsiders, they were taught, were carriers of corruption. To step beyond the ridgeline was not merely disobedience, it was betrayal of the blood and the faith. But the laws of biology do not bend to ideology. What Joseph Jackson could not see or chose to ignore was that his rules set the stage for a tragedy that would take decades to fully reveal itself. The first generation, for the first 30 years, life in the valley unfolded quietly. The initial group of settlers intermarried. Cousins wed cousins, sometimes even siblings under the guise of keeping the blood clean. Children were born in modest numbers. At first, the problem seemed subtle: an infant with unusual features here, a child who lagged behind in speech or learning there. But even in those early decades, troubling signs emerged. The Jackson children exhibited higher rates of infant mortality compared to other frontier families of the same era. Those who survived were not always healthy. Minor deformities, such as slightly misshapen limbs or extra fingers, were noted by mothers who whispered their concerns but dared not question the patriarch's teachings. After all, Joseph Jackson assured them that their bloodline was chosen, protected, and superior. Any defect was simply a test of faith. By the dawn of the 20th century, however, whispers turned into undeniable patterns. The second generation, around 1910, the second generation of Jacksons entered the world. These children, born of parents who were themselves first cousins, carried within them duplicated recessive genes that now began to manifest with cruel clarity. Some were born with congenital heart defects. Others bore cleft palates that made feeding difficult in a community with no access to doctors. Still others were mentally impaired, unable to speak beyond a few words or to comprehend basic instructions. The community's isolation ensured there was no medical help. Illness was met with prayer. Deformities were explained as divine mysteries. But behind the veil of faith lay a grim biological truth. The Jacksons were suffering the consequences of relentless inbreeding. Death was common. Many infants did not live to see their first birthday. Mothers buried child after child in crude wooden boxes, while fathers dug shallow graves into the frozen earth. Yet even this relentless loss did not break Joseph Jackson's laws. The elders insisted it was God's will. The third generation, by the 1930s, the valley's population had grown, but so too had the severity of its genetic crisis. By now, nearly every inhabitant shared significant portions of genetic material with every other. Family lines had folded into one another until the web of relationships was too tangled to trace. A man might be at once cousin, uncle, and brother-in-law to the same individual. The consequences were devastating. Children were born with clubfoot, spines twisted by scoliosis, and jaws so malformed they struggled to chew food. Many had extra digits or fused fingers and toes. Mental disabilities were so common that what would have been considered tragic in the outside world became, in the valley, the norm. For the children of the third generation, deformity was no longer an exception, it was expected. They grew up believing that their bent bodies and clouded minds were natural, because everyone around them bore the same marks. The harsh winters and relentless isolation only deepened this illusion. Trapped within the valley's walls of rock and tradition, they believed the world beyond the ridges was dangerous, sinful, and deadly. The fourth generation, the Jackson mark around 1950, the fourth generation of Jacksons was born. This generation revealed something both shocking and unique, a syndrome that the Valley's inhabitants came to call the Jackson mark. Babies entered the world with a bluish tint to their skin, a startling hue that marked them instantly as part of the family line. The cause was a rare condition known as methemoglobinemia, an enzyme deficiency that limited the blood's ability to carry oxygen. In the outside world, cases of this condition were extraordinarily rare. Within the valley, however, it became common. Dozens of children bore the telltale blue-tinged skin, and it was accepted as nothing unusual. Alongside this syndrome came increasingly grotesque deformities. Children were born with jaws so underdeveloped that their faces appeared sunken. Others had widely spaced eyes or ears twisted into unnatural shapes. Mothers who bore these children did so without complaint, convinced by the elders that such appearances were signs of divine favor, or simply the way their bloodline was meant to be. Still, survival grew harder. Many of these children died young, their frail bodies unable to endure the hardships of mountain life. The fifth generation collapsed by the 1970s. The Jackson line had reached its breaking point. Fertility rates plummeted. Infant mortality soared to terrifying levels, with 6 out of every 10 children dying before their first year. Those who survived often could not walk, talk, or even feed themselves. Some were so severely malformed that neighbors whispered they did not look human at all. Yet still the cycle continued. The elders refused to allow contact with outsiders. Families buried child after child in the rocky soil and carried on as though their suffering were predestined. It would take an act of desperation to finally break the silence of the valley. The escape. In 1983, during a violent storm that tore down parts of the crude fencing marking the valley's edge, a 16-year-old girl named Mary Jackson seized her chance. Unlike many of her kin, Mary possessed both mental clarity and physical strength. She fled the valley under cover of night, stumbling through rain, mud, and darkness until she reached a nearby town. What she told authorities seemed, at first, too horrifying to believe. She spoke of a hidden community where generations had been forced into marriages with their own cousins and uncles, where children were born twisted, blue-skinned, or mentally broken, and where leaving was forbidden under threat of death. Police dismissed her claims at first, assuming her story was exaggeration or delusion. But the girl's determination and visible fear eventually prompted them to investigate. Discovery. When law enforcement finally entered the valley, what they found defied belief. Around 240 people lived in conditions more primitive than 19th-century pioneers. Shacks without electricity or plumbing dotted the valley floor. There were no vehicles, no telephones, no radios. Many of the inhabitants had never seen a television, much less spoken to a stranger. And everywhere, the marks of inbreeding were visible. Twisted limbs, misshapen skulls, eyes that wandered in different directions, and bodies so deformed they seemed to belong to another species altogether. Doctors who later examined these people reported seeing conditions that existed only in medical textbooks or had never been documented at all. Some members of the community had developed their own rudimentary system of communication, since speech was nearly impossible for many. Others could not care for themselves and survived only with the help of equally disabled relatives. The outside world was horrified. Headlines described the discovery as a nightmare hidden in the hills. Medical experts rushed to study the community, but many found themselves shaken by the sheer extent of the genetic collapse. The Jacksons, once a family seeking purity, had become living evidence of the catastrophic consequences of prolonged isolation and inbreeding. When the authorities entered the valley in February of 1983, the silence was deafening. Wooden shacks leaned at precarious angles against the wind. Smoke from crude chimneys curled into the air. And then came the faces, dozens of them, pale, twisted, curious, and afraid. For many of these people, the arrival of outsiders was the first time in their lives they had ever seen a stranger. The investigators quickly realized that identifying individuals was nearly impossible. No one possessed birth certificates, medical records, or any form of official documentation. Instead, family lineage had been preserved in a single artifact, a worn, leather-bound Bible that had belonged to Joseph Jackson himself. The book contained handwritten notes of births, deaths, and marriages, but the entries were inconsistent and deliberately vague. Parents' names were often omitted, replaced with cryptic phrases such as "child of the valley." Some records had been altered, lines smudged or erased, as if to conceal unions deemed too close even by the elders. It soon became clear that within the valley, names were recycled. Dozens of people bore the names Joseph, Ezekiel, or Martha, paying homage to the patriarchs and matriarchs of the line. In some cases, multiple children within the same household shared the same name, further obscuring attempts to trace genealogy. What had begun as a family tree was now an impenetrable thicket of overlapping branches. Martha's testimony. Among the first to break the silence was a woman in her 50s who introduced herself as Martha Jackson. Unlike many of her kin, Martha was able to speak coherently, though her face bore the unmistakable signs of consanguinity: sloping forehead, wide-set eyes, and a jaw underdeveloped by generations of intermarriage. Martha's account confirmed Mary Jackson's story and revealed the community's inner workings. From childhood, she said, every child was taught that the world beyond the valley was dangerous, wicked, and deadly. Outsiders carried disease, sin, and corruption. Within the valley, and only within the valley, could the blood remain clean. Marriages were not matters of choice or affection. They were arranged by the Council of Elders, a group of men led by Ezekiel Jackson, the 70-year-old self-proclaimed guardian of tradition. When a girl reached the age of 13, the elders convened to decide her husband. Often this meant pairing her with a much older relative, a cousin twice removed, an uncle, or even, in some whispered cases, her own father. Refusal was unthinkable. Martha herself was an example of the tangled web that had ensnared the Jacksons. She was simultaneously the cousin and aunt of her husband, and her father was also her great-uncle. To her, this was normal until the day the outsiders came and told her otherwise. The elders' resistance. Not everyone welcomed the authorities. At the heart of the resistance stood Ezekiel Jackson. Bent with age but still commanding in presence, Ezekiel declared that the valley was sovereign, its people bound only by the laws of their blood. "We've lived this way for generations," he proclaimed. "Our blood is pure, untainted by the world's corruption. You outsiders bring poison with you. You have no right to interfere?" His words struck a chilling contrast with the physical reality around him. Children shuffled on twisted legs. Adults struggled to articulate words with malformed jaws. Entire families displayed identical deformities passed down like heirlooms. The so-called purity of the Jackson bloodline had in truth become a prison of suffering. Still, Ezekiel's influence was undeniable. Many in the community refused to cooperate with the investigation, fearing divine punishment or retaliation from the elders. Others simply did not comprehend what was happening, their mental impairments too severe to allow for clear communication. Medical revelations. Doctors who examined the Jacksons were stunned. They documented conditions so rare that most had previously only read about them in textbooks. Among the most striking were Apert syndrome, a disorder marked by craniofacial malformations and fusion of fingers and toes; Meckel syndrome, causing encephalocele protrusion of the brain through the skull alongside cystic kidneys and polydactyly; methemoglobinemia, the condition that gave the fourth generation their distinctive bluish skin; various forms of cleft palate, congenital heart defects, and severe intellectual disabilities. What made the valley remarkable was not the presence of these conditions, but their concentration. Disorders that might affect one in hundreds of thousands or even millions were common here, sometimes occurring in multiple siblings within the same family. One doctor described the valley as a living museum of genetic pathology. Another admitted that some deformities defied classification entirely. "These are conditions without names," he wrote, "features so unusual that medical literature offers no terminology. Life in the valley beyond the medical horrors." Investigators were struck by the primitive lifestyle the Jacksons endured. The valley had no electricity, no plumbing, and no access to modern tools. Families cooked over open fires, drew water from streams, and relied on hand-built wooden structures for shelter. Children played in the mud with sticks and stones, having never seen toys, books, or machines. Many had no concept of the outside world beyond what the elders told them, that it was a place of demons, sin, and destruction. The most chilling discovery was the community system of communication. Because so many residents were unable to speak clearly, a crude form of sign language had developed over generations. Investigators observed entire conversations carried out through gestures, grunts, and whistles, as though language itself had regressed alongside the family's genetic health. The psychological cage: if the physical deformities were shocking, the psychological conditioning was equally disturbing. Generations of Jacksons had been raised to believe that suffering was holy. Deformity was natural and obedience was sacred. Leaving the valley was portrayed as the ultimate sin of betrayal, not only of family, but of God. Children grew up surrounded by deformity, and so they accepted it as normal. A boy born with 6 fingers on each hand did not see himself as different, for his siblings and cousins shared the same trait. A girl with crossed eyes and slurred speech considered herself ordinary, for nearly every child around her struggled in the same way. This normalization of suffering ensured the cycle continued unbroken. To question tradition was to risk banishment, a punishment that, in practice, meant death in the wilderness beyond the ridges. The World Reacts news of the Jackson family spread quickly beyond the mountains. Newspapers described the discovery as a lost tribe of deformity. Medical journals published case studies, while anthropologists debated the cultural implications of such long-term isolation. Some voices called for compassion, emphasizing that the Jacksons were victims of circumstance, trapped by geography and indoctrination. Others saw them as a chilling warning of what happens when ideology collides with biology. The valley, once hidden in obscurity, had become a spectacle. Outsiders flocked to the area, some out of scientific curiosity, others out of morbid fascination. For the Jacksons, who had been shielded from the outside world for a century, the sudden attention was bewildering and terrifying. Breaking the chains, despite resistance from the elders, authorities began the difficult task of dismantling the isolation that had defined the valley for more than 100 years. Children were removed for medical care. Some were placed in foster homes, others in hospitals where they received treatments unavailable in the valley. For many, the outside world was overwhelming. A simple electric light, a moving car, or a television screen was enough to leave them stunned. Doctors reported that some children cried uncontrollably at the sight of airplanes flying overhead, convinced they were demons descending from the sky. Rehabilitation was slow, often heartbreaking. While some younger children adapted, many older members of the community were too deeply conditioned or too cognitively impaired to adjust. They clung to the valley, to their traditions, and to the words of Ezekiel Jackson, who insisted that salvation lay in isolation. The investigation into the Jackson Valley reached its most volatile stage when outsiders attempted to dismantle the walls of tradition that had kept the family bound for over a century. If Part 1 revealed the origins of isolation, and Part 2 unveiled the grotesque consequences of inbreeding, Part 3 is where the world collided directly with the elders' grip on their people. Ezekiel's stand at the heart of this resistance was Ezekiel Jackson, the self-appointed patriarch of the valley. At 70 years old, Ezekiel had lived his entire life within the ridges, never once setting foot beyond the mountains. His body bore the unmistakable signs of consanguinity: broad forehead, slanted eyes, and a jaw that jutted unnaturally, but his voice carried conviction. "This is our blood," Ezekiel declared to the authorities who questioned him. "It is holy, it is clean. It is untouched by the filth of the world you come from. He argued that outsiders sought not to save the community, but to destroy it. To Ezekiel, doctors were agents of corruption, bringing foreign ideas that would sever the sacred bonds of kinship. And to many of the valley's older inhabitants, his words rang true. They had been raised to see outsiders as demons. Ezekiel's fiery speeches only reinforced the fears burned into their minds since childhood. The struggle for cooperation. For investigators, the challenge was enormous. Younger members of the community, those like Mary Jackson, who had managed to escape, were more open to the possibility of life beyond the valley. But the majority, conditioned from birth and often mentally impaired, refused to trust the strangers. Some children hid behind their mothers when doctors tried to examine them. Others screamed and thrashed, convinced that outsiders were trying to poison them. Elders forbade cooperation outright, ordering families not to answer questions or permit medical tests. Without records, without names, and without consent, unraveling the valley's genetic and social history became a painstaking puzzle. Disturbing discoveries. Still, evidence accumulated. Doctors cataloged condition after condition, building a portrait of what decades of forced inbreeding had wrought. Polydactyly, extra fingers and toes were so common that they were considered normal within the valley. Some adults had as many as 12 fingers. Encephalocele. A few children were born with portions of their brains protruding through gaps in their skulls, covered only by thin layers of skin. Cleft palates. A shocking number of infants had gaps in the roof of the mouth, making it impossible to feed without constant risk of choking. Many starved before reaching their first birthday. Microcephaly. Several children had abnormally small skulls, their foreheads sloping sharply backward, accompanied by severe intellectual disabilities. For the medical teams, it was a harrowing experience. They were not just examining patients. They were witnessing the collapse of human genetics in real time. One doctor later confessed, "It was like walking through a living textbook of everything that can go wrong with the human body. Only here. It wasn't one in a million, it was one in every few children." Primitive records. The Bible at the center of the valley's record-keeping became a crucial piece of evidence. Investigators spent weeks analyzing the handwritten notes, attempting to trace lineage. What they found was chilling. Entire pages listed children as simply child of the valley, with no parents recorded. Others bore cryptic notes like daughter of the pure blood or born of the sacred union. Many entries had been scratched out, rewritten, or layered over with different inks, suggesting deliberate attempts to obscure truth. The genealogy chart that emerged was less a tree than a tangled knot. Cousins married cousins. Nieces were given to uncles. In at least 2 cases, the evidence pointed to direct incest between fathers and daughters. Psychological conditioning. Perhaps the most disturbing revelation was not genetic, but cultural. Children were indoctrinated from birth with the belief that their suffering was divine. Mothers were taught not to question deformities. Fathers were instructed to enforce obedience. Every Sunday, the community gathered in a makeshift chapel where Ezekiel and the elders preached. Their sermons emphasized purity, blood, and obedience. "The outside world is sickness," they would intone. "Stay within the valley, and you will remain clean." This conditioning ensured that even those capable of rational thought remained trapped. To step beyond the ridges was to betray family, faith, and God. Confrontations with authorities. As word spread, state officials demanded the removal of children from the valley for their own safety. But implementing this order was far from simple. Mothers clutched their children tightly, weeping as authorities tried to separate them. Fathers blocked doorways with axes and pitchforks. Ezekiel himself confronted a team of social workers, declaring, "You may take our lives, but you will never take our blood. We will not be diluted by your poison." The standoff reached a breaking point when a group of law enforcement officers entered the valley with warrants. They escorted doctors and social workers to remove the most vulnerable children, those with life-threatening conditions requiring immediate care. The scene was chaotic. Some families surrendered their children reluctantly. Others resisted violently, forcing officers to drag screaming boys and girls from their parents' arms. The valley, once silent and hidden, echoed with wails of anguish and shouts of fury. Stories of suffering among those taken was a 6-year-old boy with a Pert syndrome. His skull was misshapen, his fingers fused into stiff paddles, his breathing labored. Doctors later performed multiple surgeries to separate his digits and reconstruct portions of his face, but the years of neglect had left irreversible damage. Another case involved a girl of 10 who had never walked. Her legs were twisted and brittle, her spine curved into an unnatural arc. She had been carried her whole life, passed from mother to sister to cousin. To her, this was normal. Only when she was shown a wheelchair in the hospital did she realize other ways of movement existed. One teenager, estimated to be about 15, could not speak at all. He communicated solely through grunts and hand signals developed within the valley. His IQ was later measured at below 40, leaving him with the mental age of a toddler. For outsiders, these stories were heartbreaking. For the Jacksons, they were everyday life. Divided reactions outside the valley, the revelations provoked fierce debate. Some demanded that the entire community be relocated and reintegrated into society, no matter the resistance. Others argued that forcing assimilation would only traumatize people who had never known anything else. Anthropologists compared the case to studies of isolated tribes, warning against cultural imperialism. But medical professionals countered that allowing the cycle to continue would mean condemning future generations to unbearable suffering. Meanwhile, the valley itself grew increasingly fractured. Younger members, curious about the outside world, began questioning the elders' authority. Older members, terrified of change, clung more tightly to Ezekiel's words. The once unified community was splitting apart under the weight of exposure. Ezekiel's last words as pressure mounted, Ezekiel doubled down. In his final recorded sermon, he thundered, "We are chosen. The world cannot touch us. They may steal our children, but they cannot steal our purity. Our blood will endure when theirs is ash." But even as he spoke, his people were slipping away, some willingly, others taken by force, many simply dying from conditions no longer sustainable without intervention. When the world finally learned of the Jackson Valley in 1983, it was as though a curtain had been pulled back on a hidden nightmare. What outsiders found dozens of families twisted by generations of inbreeding, living in isolation just kilometers from modern society, was not only shocking, it was almost unbelievable, yet the evidence was undeniable. The fallout in the immediate aftermath, state and federal authorities stepped in. Children with severe deformities and life-threatening conditions were transported to hospitals. Social services placed some in foster care, though integration was difficult. Many could not speak, did not understand basic hygiene, and were terrified of cars, lights, and televisions. Older members of the valley resisted relocation. Some fled into the forest when officials arrived, returning only after outsiders left. Others clung stubbornly to the only world they had ever known. Despite the horrors uncovered, many still saw the valley as sacred ground, their deformities as proof of divine testing rather than biological collapse. The government faced a moral dilemma. Should the Jacksons be forcibly assimilated into society? Or should their cultural autonomy be respected despite the devastating genetic toll? In practice, both paths were taken. Some families left under pressure. Others remained in the valley under loose monitoring. Medical studies for scientists, the Jackson Valley became a rare case study in genetics. Teams of doctors and researchers published papers documenting the extraordinary concentration of rare conditions. A Pert syndrome, Meckel syndrome, methemoglobinemia. The list read like a medical encyclopedia condensed into one small community. Photographs taken for medical purposes revealed haunting images: children with fused fingers, adults with sloping skulls, babies with blue-tinged skin. Many of these photos were never released to the public, withheld out of respect for the individuals involved. But in academic circles, the Jackson case became infamous, a living example of what unchecked inbreeding can cause. One researcher summarized the tragedy bluntly: "This family became a genetic experiment without consent. Nature was the laboratory." The result was devastation, psychological trauma for those who left the valley. Adapting to the outside world was almost as traumatic as the conditions they escaped. Some younger children adjusted quickly, fascinated by toys, food, and electricity. Others, especially teenagers, struggled. They had been told all their lives that the world beyond the ridges was evil. Now, confronted with technology and strangers, they were overwhelmed. Mary Jackson, the girl whose escape first exposed the valley, remained a pivotal figure. Initially hailed as a hero, she also bore the scars of her upbringing. Interviews described her as quiet, wary, and deeply mistrustful. She often spoke of nightmares, visions of the valley, the sermons of the elders, the cries of deformed children. Though she had broken free, the psychological weight of her childhood never fully lifted. The elders' decline as the younger generation trickled out. The power of the elders weakened. Ezekiel Jackson, once the unchallenged patriarch, grew increasingly isolated. His sermons, once met with reverence, began to echo through near-empty gatherings. By the time of his death in the late 1980s, much of the community had either left or been fractured beyond repair. Without strong leadership, the valley drifted into decline. Shacks collapsed, fields lay fallow, and the remaining families struggled to survive. What had once been a closed society bound by tradition dissolved into a shadow of itself. Ethical questions. The Jackson case sparked intense debate in medical and ethical circles. Should authorities have intervened sooner? How had a community of nearly 250 people remained hidden in plain sight for so long? And perhaps most controversially, did removing children from their families violate cultural rights, or was it a necessary act of protection? The case highlighted the thin line between respecting cultural autonomy and preventing human suffering. For some, the Jacksons were victims of neglect, abandoned by a society that never noticed their plight until it was too late. For others, they were evidence of why isolation cannot be left unchecked. The vanishing valley by the 1990s, the Jackson Valley had all but disappeared from headlines. Authorities discouraged visitors, fearing exploitation. Rumors circulated about survivors' blue-skinned descendants spotted in nearby towns, children raised in foster homes who still carried the physical markers of inbreeding. But the community itself faded into obscurity, its population dwindling with each passing year. Today, little remains. The shacks have rotted, reclaimed by weeds and forest. Graves dot the hillsides, many marked only by crude wooden crosses, their names long forgotten. The valley that once echoed with sermons, cries, and whispers of secrecy now lies silent. The legacy of the Jacksons lingers. Their story is cited in genetics courses, anthropology lectures, and ethics debates. It is a chilling reminder of how isolation and ideology can warp both body and mind. The Jacksons began as settlers seeking purity. In their quest to protect their faith, they severed ties with the outside world. Over 7 generations, that isolation became their undoing. What they called pure blood was, in truth, a genetic trap that condemned their descendants to suffering. Perhaps the most haunting aspect is not the deformities, but the normalization of them. For the Jackson children, bent spines, fused fingers, and blue skin were not abnormal, they were simply life. Deformity was the standard, and health was the exception. A final reflection: the story of the Jacksons forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What happens when tradition overrides science? When fear replaces reason? When a community closes itself off so completely that suffering becomes invisible to the outside world? In the end, the Jackson Valley was not just a tragedy of genetics. It was a tragedy of belief so strong that it blinded generations to the suffering in front of them. As one investigator later reflected, the most shocking thing wasn't the deformities, it was that they didn't see them as deformities at all. They thought this was normal. That's the true horror. And so the Jackson family remains, even in absence, a ghost story of modern times, a warning whispered through the Appalachian hills. A reminder that isolation, carried too far, can twist not just bodies, but the very meaning of what it is to be human. Thank you for watching this video. Click here to watch another video that might interest you.